Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 80 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Joined by my co-host Mary, a woman who was always mad at me for something. I am merely a surrendered dish rag named Darren. Hey, Mary, how are you?
Well, I just found out that the Indians lost their season opener.
It's the Guardians.
Anyway, I'm good. Happy to be recording. How are you?
Oh, God. Awesome. My team is undefeated. We're 0-0.
My team is like I say, I can make so many references to the Civil War and the way the Indians play. For instance, the Great Halt describes the 2016 World Series. And tonight's game, when they put the bullpen in, just describes Shiloh day 2 for the Confederates. So
it's okay.
We're off to a really awesome start.
You've got 161 more losses to go. So don't you worry about it. So what else is going on besides? We got some fun stuff to talk about tonight, Mary.
Well, speaking of losses, we're getting into our first episode of Appomattox.
That in the industry is called a segue. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Appomattox Campaign, the end of the line for the Army of Northern Virginia, and realistically the beginning of the end of the Confederacy as a whole. But before we talk about the shenanigans of the night, I'm going to be a gracious host and not forget, and I'm going to ask you, what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking Ghost Orchid by Bellwoods Brewery out of Toronto, which is one of their new IPAs, and it is amazing. And it has, I don't know, the name has nothing to do with the episode, but it's got really cool can art on it, and it's a really great IPA. But my mug has something to do with tonight's episode. I'm drinking it out of my General Meade mug because he is part of this Appomattox campaign and what will eventually be the surrender. And I don't know, I really feel that Meade gets overshadowed in all of this. It's a lot of Grant, it's a lot of Sheridan, it's a lot of Lee, it's all of that.
Well, we all know, Mary, that Meade was fired when Grant took over. I heard that on a podcast somewhere.
Fuck.
I want to get you going about that.
Jesus, that's what I had to do. Anyway. My PSA on Facebook about Meade was not fired.
So you're gonna show your mug, or we're just gonna?
Oh my God.
Do here?
Well, it's kind of hard for me to show it on like just the Zoom video doesn't allow me.
With the entire battle going on behind you.
I think our listeners know what George Meade looked like, so I am drinking it out of my George Meade mug. And what's are you drinking?
Well, I never thought you'd ask. I'm drinking. It is called Big Bang IPA, and there you go. I call it Big Bang because, well, I don't know why. That's what I had, and I'm drinking it out of my Sherman Dye Mad mug because Sherman's part of this whole thing, sort of. He's we're not going to talk about Uncle Blingy tonight, but he's certainly a part of it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to turn back time a little bit.
If I could turn back time.
Don't ever do that again. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Petersburg. We're going to kind of start from there. We're going to work our way forward. Now, I don't know if you know this, Mary, but we're going to do a two-parter tonight, okay? We're going to take this as far as we can at Appomattox, and then we're going to see what happens. And we're going to do one of those cliffhangery things and see what happens with it. And then we'll finish this up next time. So we're going to kind of go back and set the whole Appomattox campaign up, okay? Now, on April 2nd, real quick, just to summarize, April 2nd, 1865, the Union is going to break the Confederate line at Petersburg, which will sign that death warrant for the rebel capital of Richmond, right? Now, Petersburg was the rail supply hub for Richmond, where 5 railroads all connected. And really what it did is it fed supplies to the capital, right? The Rebs knew if Petersburg fell, they could not possibly hold Richmond. They were basically screwed. So to defend Petersburg, the Rebs set up that Dimmock line, right? Back in by the summer of 1864, those trenches they built were down to like 2,000, 2,500 guys. So the people, was limited. So Grant is doing his overland campaign, right? And after the Battle of Cold Harbor, U.S. Grant's, he's going to order General William Baldy Smith, a good New Englander, Mary, from St. Albans, Vermont, by the way. I don't know if you knew that.
I did.
Okay, I'm pretty sure you didn't. But he ordered him to seize Petersburg, right? So once Smith got to Petersburg, he sees those trenches. Now, he doesn't know there's only 2,500 guys. He just sees the trenches. And he's remembering that Cold Harbor bloodbath that he just experienced. And he got a little scared is what happened to him, okay? So he delayed that attack just long enough for Robert E. Lee, to reinforce the trenches. And really what that did is that kicked off that 9-month siege
Yeah.
of Petersburg, right? And that's kind of what it was. Now, during the siege, Grant tried to cut the railroad lines. Like I mentioned, there was 5 of them. He attacked the Weldon Railroad on June 21st, 1864, and he used that 6th Corps,
Mhm.
which was his go-to corps this time of the war for
I
everything,
know the 6
apparently.
Corps is everywhere.
It was, break glass, get the 6th Corps in case of emergency. But I mean, it was kind of a disaster. It resulted in about 2,000 prisoners of war for the Union. They all got sent to Andersonville in Georgia. Um, and that leads to that July 30th, 1864, Grant okays that infamous crater situation. Speaking of the Big Bang, Mary, okay, which was the brainchild of Ambrose Burnside, another solid New Englander. That led to like those
Not one
4,000.
of your prouder guys, though.
Hey, nothing wrong with him. He's a good guy, Sox fan, so he's a good guy. But it led to those 4,000 casualties for the Union, mostly those USCT guys, right?
Yep.
Now, this is going back and forth. And eventually, Lee, as you know, Mary, Lee is very aggressive. He's very offensive.
Yep.
He's been sitting around doing nothing, just defending. And so he wants to be a little offensive here himself. So what he's going to go ahead and he's going to attack Fort Stedman on March 25th, 1865, using John B. Gordon, which is going to initially show some success, but then it's going to kind of peter out.
Yeah, and it began in the early morning, and Trudeau, in his book The Last Citadels, describes it as one of the most methodical attacks of the Civil War. Like, Gordon goes into this, like, I don't know what he's on, but he's like, yeah, I can take this. And he's like, I think he was talking it up to Lee, and he said, the disintegration of the whole left wing of the Federal Army, or at least the dealing of such a staggering blow upon it, would disable it temporarily, enabling us to withdraw from Petersburg in safety to join Johnson in North Carolina. And as we're going to talk about, this is the big thing. We got to get to Johnston, right? So the fort is captured, but Union General Park, who is the commander there, he's like, fuck this, you're not taking my fort. And he counterattacks and he recaptures it and the batteries. The Confederates end up with 4,000 casualties, including 1,000 captured, which at this point in the war, they don't need to be losing any more men, and they are. And this is one of the reasons why Stedman, it's not, it's not the most important battle in the Appomattox campaign, but it is one of these ones that it's like, we gained nothing from this. Like, one soldier wrote home to his wife and said, I can't give you the particulars, but we have gained nothing. And another described it as only a meteor's flash that illuminates for a moment and leaves the night darker than before. So in other words, well, shit, we're no better off. Even Gordon was like, well, we're fucked. Then it just, Stedman does absolutely nothing for them.
No, Stedman is going to prove to be the last offensive attack for Lee at any point with this. But really, it was similar to Ambrose Wright at Gettysburg. They break through, but they just don't have the guys to hold it. They get pushed back. Ends up with 45 or so 100 casualties. And to your point, you ain't got many guys. You can't go to the soldier factory and get more soldiers anymore.
No, and this is not like, and not only if you have a battle are you going to lose men, but you have to remember at this time that they are losing men to desertions. Desertions are, I think, very, very high at this point in the Army in Northern Virginia. The other thing too is the men don't have the fight in them. I mean, they're not living on very good rations. When you look to the Union Army, which is having fresh bread delivered every day because they have those bakeries set up thanks to Hooker when he made all those changes to the Army of the Potomac. They have that. They're able to feed their men, where Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, they don't have that. And they are like, I mean, as much as the spirit is willing, sometimes you just physically can't. And I think that's what this is also showing too.
Well, it's tough when you have the Union's getting Krispy Kreme delivered every single day to the battle lines, and the Confederates are just starving.
They're getting Tim Hortons donuts.
They're getting days old Tim Hortons donuts.
Yeah.
They're getting one of the good ones. But Lee's men, were breaking, and Grant certainly knew it. So late in the night of April 1st and going into early April 2nd, 1865, 14,000 guys from around that 6th Corps are going to find themselves lying on their stomachs waiting to attack. Now, we were talking before, the Confederates, they're sick of this crap. The Union is too. 10 o'clock at night on 4/1, 1865, the Union artillery is going to open up and blast away for 2 full hours with
Yep.
more guns than they use at Gettysburg. That's how many guns were being used in this assault. Now, the infantry, they knew this war was almost done, and they're thinking, shit, do I want to get killed at the very end? No. So when they get the order to move, they're like, they're like trying to
Yeah.
get you to move. So the soldiers had to use
Fucker.
swords, and the officers whack him in the butt
Oh
just to
my
get
God.
him going. That's true. And to get these guys moving because they didn't
God,
want to
wasn't that
go.
Barlow's move when he wanted to get his men moving? When he was in the
What?
11th Corps, Barlow, he used to whack his soldiers back, like,
So anyway, as I was saying, Mary, the rebel line was finally broken after a 9-month siege. And the first guy to cross it is a guy from Vermont named Charles Gould. He's the captain of Company H of the 5th Vermont. Now, these 15,000 Union men are going to go through a field which is known today as Pamplin Park, right?
Yep.
And Gould's going to reach that rebel earthworks. He's going to jump over them. He's going to be bayoneted several times. He'll be stabbed in the face, stabbed in the side.
Reading
He's
that
going to
about him.
He's going to get the Medal of Honor, but you know what's going to happen? He's going to survive.
Yep.
And he's going to get brought back, and he's going to live to be 71 years old. You can't kill a New Englander, Mary. You can't. It's
You can't.
impossible, right? And so he's going to survive. Now, Robert E. Lee, at this point, the line is broken, okay? And he knows it is time, as you say, to vacate the dance floor, okay? And as they say around the streets here, it's a GTFO out of Petersburg, okay?
Yep.
So he's going to drop a plan to take what's left of his army, which is around 35,000, 40,000 guys, these weary war vets at this point, and they're going to escape Grant's army with the hopes of marching to North Carolina to meet up with Joseph E. Johnston's equally battered army that we talked about, the Department of North Carolina in
Yep.
Southern Virginia. And they're going to try to cobble together what's left of these remnants of these armies in hopes to try to keep the South alive. But you hinted at it a little while ago. The biggest challenge Lee has is feeding these guys. Okay, so we talked before. We talked and the horses and the mules. Speaking of them, no one thinks
not
about
only
them, right?
not only the guys, but the horses too. Like Lee knew it was back in February 8th, 1865. He wrote the new Confederate Secretary of War, John C. Breckinridge. He said, "You must not be surprised if calamity befalls us." And this is, when you have like Fort Fisher has fallen, Wilmington and all that, right? These are major Confederate supply bases. And if they can't get their supplies, one of the reasons, like Lee knows he's got to leave at some point, but one of the reasons he can't is because due to, first of all, muddy roads, which we've seen many times in the Civil War, but also because he can't feed his horses the proper rations that they need per day to be able to haul the shit out of there, right? And that's a huge thing. Lee needed to leave sooner, but he couldn't for that reason.
No, he's stuck. When he finally does go, though, he's going to march his army in 4 columns. They're all going to pour out of those trenches in Petersburg. You know what? They're in pretty good spirits overall.
Yep.
They're sick of sitting around. They want to move. Lee himself, there's that story where he sat on Traveler, his horse, at a fork in the road, and he encouraged his men as they passed by, and he stayed until the very last guy went. He stayed there encouraging his guys because he knew that he had to do it. Now, he had hoped to have 3 of those 4 columns march along the Appomattox River to a place called Amelia Courthouse that we're going to talk a lot about here. And the fourth one is going to already be south of the river, and they're just going to go straight west to Amelia. Now, the plan is once they get to Amelia, they're going to be fed, okay? There are 350,000 rations waiting for them in Amelia, okay? And so they're going to get there, they're going to eat, they're going to have a big feast, and they're going to move to Danville, Virginia, and then cross that border into North Carolina to go meet up with Johnston. Now, one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot with this, and we talked a lot about retreats. We talked about Hood's retreat from Nashville. We talked a lot about, obviously, Meade's retreat. And the one common thing is the terrain. And this is one that doesn't get talked about a lot either. The terrain is garbage, okay? They're going to march through heavy brush and narrow roads. But the benefit they had is they had a 2-day head start on Grant. They had 2 days. So they knew they had to move fast. If they did, they can get to Amelia, they could eat, and then get to North Carolina before Grant could catch them. That was the plan. Now, the whole thing with the Appomattox Campaign for Lee is time. The clock was running, and he knew it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it was. And, the one thing, too, about this retreat is the soldiers like that are going on it. And as you said, morale was really, really high. But amongst his officers, one of them being John Brown Gordon, he said there was no hope for us but retreat. So Gordon knows that the end is near for them. And some soldiers refused to really believe things were bad. And one of them said, H.C. Wall, a North Carolina soldier, said it was not until the march had taken direction to and through the half-deserted streets, and noble women were observed weeping as in the agony of despair, that the realization came forcibly to mind that the once lovely city was being abandoned to the ruthless invader. So they're realizing, like, holy shit, shit just got real. And the Confederates, before they leave Petersburg, they set fire to it, because that's what you do. If you can't take, your supplies with you, you're going to burn them so your enemy can't get them. So the first building.
That's what I do when I move.
Yep. Great idea. The first buildings torched by the Confederates were the tobacco warehouses. But there's one story that I wanted to tell, and that is to do with John Brown Gordon. And he says, his troops are the last to leave Petersburg, they're bringing up the rear of the Confederate army, and they have to protect supply trains. But Gordon said the breaking of Lee's power had shattered the last hope of Southern independence. But he also, part of his personal story is that he has to leave his wife behind. His wife has been with him through the entire Civil War. And he says, I had left behind me in the city of gloom the wife who had followed me during the entire war. She was ill. But as I rode away from Petersburg during the dismal hours of that night, I found comfort in the hope that some chivalric soldier of the Union Army would learn of her presence and guard her home against all intruders. My confidence in American manhood was not misplaced. And I did kind of wonder when I read that quote, Gordon was a Mason. Am I right in that? I'm wondering if there was something to that, and if he left her.
Masons don't.
Oh God! But I actually wondered if he left her with something that would say to help protect her, right? That he was very concerned about her. But this is, one of the like kind of the human side of things that's happening to these guys too. So as I said, Gordon's bringing up the rear, and he remarks that protecting it is impossible because Grant, with characteristic vigor, is pressing the pursuit. And it soon became a continuous and final battle. Fighting all day, marching all night with exhaustion and hunger, claiming their victims at every mile of the march. With charge of infantry in rear and cavalry on the flanks, it seemed the war god had turned loose all the furies in revel and havoc. So this is the retreat. It is, and these men, the Confederates, are so tired.
And it gets worse and worse. They start that march. They leave Petersburg with, guess how many days rations? 1 day's rations. That's all they leave with. That's all they got. Because you're thinking they're going to get to Amelia and they're going to load up. Now, as you just talked about, Grant is going to send Phil Sheridan's cavalry to chase Lee's retreating army, followed by his infantry. I mentioned before, they have a 2-day, about a 48-hour lead. Now, Sheridan is going to be nipping at Lee's heels, and eventually he's going to meet up with his rear guard on April 3rd at a place called Namazine Church. Now, this is cavalry going up against infantry, so it's in cavalry too. The infantry is not there yet, but the cavalry is. So here, you're going to end up with 1,000 federal cavalry led by George Custer, mainly the brigade of a guy named William Wells, and he's going to collide with Fitzhugh Lee's 700 guys. Now, Lee is ultimately going to be able to hold back Custer and drive them back, right? But after the battle, Sheridan is going to be operating independently, commanding that army of the Shenandoah, reporting to Grant. And he will arrive at Namazine, and he's going to meet with Custer to try to formulate a plan to cut off Lee's retreat. Now, most of Lee's army is still way ahead. They're way forward ahead with that two-day head start. The federal cavalry is able to catch up with that rear guard, but again, the cavalry isn't infantry. There's only so much they can really do. Lee's army had the lead, but again, time was ticking away, and that whole escape plan, like we mentioned, was based on keeping pace from Grant, who was moving really fast to keep up with them.
Oh, he's going so quickly. And, like Grant and Meade had met before all this took place. And, they're kind of debating what to do next. Meade believed that, just from what a prisoner had told them, that Lee was going to go back only a short distance and would stand in a prearranged defensive position. And Grant is like, no, he's not going to do that. So Grant is convinced that Lee is going to retreat along the Danville Road, and Meade just finally agrees and says the army is going to be organized to pursue. And that's exactly what happens.
Well, those 3 columns north of Appomattox, and this is where things kind of go wrong, right? Those 3 columns north of the Appomattox had to cross 3 bridges, and this is where the first of the issues of time is going to catch up with them.
Yep.
There'll be problems. The Bevel Bridge was one of the bridges was completely washed out. They couldn't use it. The second was called the Ganito Bridge, and that couldn't be forded. You know why? Because the supplies they ordered didn't arrive. And somewhere in 1862, Ambrose Burnside is laughing at full Fredericksburg at this point, okay? Because that same thing happens. He's like, ha, 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 I know that feeling.
Ha, fuckers, look at you now.
So what happened was it caused delays because now all 3 of those columns have to cross in the same area. And now the time is ticking. So April 4th, 7 o'clock in the morning, they've been marching all night long, and Lee and his men will cross the Appomattox, and they're still, driven by those hopes of food waiting for them at Amelia Station. Now, they are tired, they're hungry. The band was probably playing Dave Matthews songs, so they were miserable. That's how bad.
Or Justin Bieber.
Probably you probably like that. They probably dancing with that, probably.
Oh God, no.
I've seen you dance. Trust me, no one's winning that situation. But the army's approaching Amelia Courthouse. They're getting close. So what Lee's going to do? He's going to ride Traveler. He's going to jump ahead. Is what he's going to do. He's going to run all the way ahead, and he's going to get to the train station and check on the trains that are waiting for his arrival. Lee's going to get to the railroad station, and he saw all the cars lined up, and they opened them up, and what he saw stunned him. Okay, one of the officers said Lee displayed, and I quote, intense agony and was shaken to the core when they opened these. When they opened the trains, they contained 200 crates of ammo, 100 caissons, and 160 boxes of artillery harnesses. Guess what it didn't contain?
Food.
No food, okay?
Fuck.
A clerical error, some sort of error along the way delivered ammo to Amelia Courthouse instead of food. Now, they were expecting 350,000 rations, and all the guys were looking forward to it. Lee rides ahead and opens it and goes, shit, okay? And now...
Did that guy get a promotion? I bet he did. I bet he got a promotion.
But you have to imagine what he's thinking at this point. His tired and hungry army is approaching, expecting to be fed, okay? And not just them, but the animals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's none. So Lee has to tell his men when they get there, okay, we need to halt the march, and we have to go forage for yourselves. Do what you can do. He wrote an appeal to the citizens of Amelia for food to try to see what can be done. So now it's the morning of April 5th. So now he's sitting around there. He's stuck. And his men in Amelia are waiting for the food. The citizens, they have no food. They got nothing.
Yep.
There's nothing. So there's nothing they can forage. No one has any food. And now, knowing his men, this grim reality, I guess, that his men are completely starving, he has no choice that he has to keep moving because Grant is right coming up to Savannah now.
Yeah.
So he has to move. Grant's getting closer, and that clock is ticking faster and faster. So you can only imagine what's going through these guys' minds.
Oh, it must be just, like, I can't imagine what it like, and they're just like Grant, like Gordon said, Grant is just relentless in this pursuit. He's constantly at them, nipping at their heels. There's battles every single day. And, Gordon does remark in his memoirs, he hardly slept. So that means Lee probably hardly slept during this pursuit, that leads right into, April the 9th. But there is one story that I wanted to tell that happens around this time. And it's one that I'm going to start, but I will finish in the next episode. So Gordon captured 2 supposedly Confederate officers, but it was discovered that they were Union soldiers impersonating Confederate officers. And it took them forever to find out. And finally, someone on Gordon's staff was like, well, take their boots off. So they took the boots off the one guy and found he had an order from General Grant to General Ord. And Gordon just looks at them and says, well, you know your fate. Under the laws of war, you have forfeited your lives by wearing this uniform, and I shall have you shot at sunrise tomorrow. And one of the soldiers just looks at him and says, "You have the right to have a shot, but the war can't last much longer. And it would do you no good to have us killed." And Gordon doesn't say this at the time, but he writes in his memoirs, "I had no thought of having them executed, but I did not tell them so." And we will pick that story back up in the next episode.
Ooh, cannot wait. Cannot wait.
So, I mean, probably know what happens to them, but
no, I know what happened to him. But so Lee finds out there's no food at Amelia Courthouse. So he knows he has to keep moving. So on April 5th now, the men are going to wake up. They find out that there's no food, and they're going to be told they have to do a forced march to all the way to Danville, which is 100 miles away. It's a 4-day march now, okay? And where they're told there's 500,000 rations waiting for them. So they're probably going, okay.
oh,
But
BS.
okay, so that's so you're already hungry. Now you're 100 miles, 4 days, 25 miles a day. Notice the math, Mary. Okay, that's a long
Yes,
time to go.
I've come a long way with my math skills, but you know what? I would have heard that and I would be noping the fuck out of there and deserting and risking execution because nope, no way.
Don't question. But around this time, Lee is going to find out. He's going to hear that there might be food in the town of Burkeville, which is just 18 miles away. And Lee is going to wire ahead, and he's going to say basically, "Hey, is it true you got food? If they do have food, instead of 4-day march, we're talking 1 day. Okay,
The
so it's much,
DQs
much
must have been open for business.
it had to have been, right? But Grant was close, and Lee couldn't wait for the response. He's like, "All right, everybody get in the car. We're going to go check it out anyway. We have to go." So they're all going to start marching towards Burkeville, and with the hopes that food's going to be there. So around a boot 1 p.m., okay, on April 5th, okay, see that. Lee is going to learn that he's on his way to Burkeville. He has to go through a town called Jetersville, okay? And waiting in Jetersville, and this is right on the path to Burkeville, is Sheridan and his federal cavalry, which is entrenched, waiting for Lee, okay?
Mhm.
Now, Lee's path to Burkeville is completely blocked now, so he needs a new plan. Now, as the rebels do get near Jetersville, Lee himself is going to ride the line, and he's going to see Sheridan's entrenchments. And he did think about attacking, okay, but he realized his men are too hungry and too tired, and there's no way they can do it. So he has to tell his guys, who are miserable already, that it's impossible to go to Burkeville. So now we're going to turn west, and we're going to go 60 miles to Lynchburg instead. Okay. Now this is ridiculous, right? Now Lee was desperate and running out of time. When Lee gave the order they were not going to Burkeville, and now instead going all the way to Lynchburg, he said it was the cruelest marching order they ever got in their lives. That's how bad this was, because he knew the terrain, he knew how long it was going to take, he knew they were going to be hit every step along the way, and he knew there was no hope whatsoever because the landscape was terrible. The way they had to walk, it was full of swamps, there was dense woods, totally filled with
Probably
clowns.
clowns.
Right? And absolutely they were. The roads were completely impassable, right? Now, his men were at the point they were so hungry, they were starting to become delirious and hallucinating. That's how hungry you'd get, right? Now, as they marched, they were eating leaves off the trees. They were eating bark off the trees, which I will
Oh,
take over. I will take over broccoli any day. But regardless, that's how it was.
don't knock it
Picture
till
the
you try it, especially with a
yeah,
bit of cheese.
my opinion on broccoli.
I do.
But they were eating. That's what they were left to try to eat with. Now, despite the hunger, the thing what's interesting about this though is you read these stories. They were hungry and they were miserable, but they still had that spirit. They hadn't
Yeah,
given up. So
they
you
did.
think
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. I was going to say, Gordon talks about that a lot in his memoirs, that just the fighting spirit that these men still had at this point in the war, and you think it's like, my God, you're eating leaves, but you're still like, yeah, let's follow him.
Well, I mean, if you think back to Five Forks, right? That took. We didn't really talk about that on this one, but we did a whole episode on Five Forks
Yeah.
on April 1st of 1865. If you remember, 1,000 Rebs surrendered. Okay, only 100 took the oath of allegiance to the U.S.
Yep.
So that's 90% said screw. That's how
Yep.
much spirit these guys still had, right?
Yep.
Now, these men, they did have stragglers, and and a lot of the men tossed their rifles as they were walking because they were just too heavy to carry. They were just so
Yep.
hungry. So you get to April 6th now, the Rebs are marching in what they call a gloomy silence. That's how it was called. His hunger and fatigue is really, really setting in now. The terrain is full of undulations, right?
Ugh.
And and you got to think about there. Every incline, every hill must have felt like Heartbreak Hill at the Boston Marathon at this
Yeah.
point, right? Your legs are giving out, you're atrophy, and you're just tired. Now, Lee himself has started to show effects of this hunger as well. I mean, don't forget he's dealing with heart issues, and he's an old dude, Mary, right?
Yeah.
Observers said that his eyes were sunken. He was hazard looking, or as what you call Saturday morning, but he remained calm the whole time in the face of all
Yeah.
this stuff. So he's feeling it, but emotionally and mentally, he's still sharp.
Yeah.
And, and despite the lack of food, and Grant on his heels, he still feels pretty good about getting North Carolina and going to hook up with Johnston.
Well, I think if you recall our episodes that we did about Davis and his escape, there's still this kind of like, there's this propaganda going on that they can still do this. Davis is going around. While Lee is doing this, kind of this kind of march to keep away from Grant and to get to Johnson. Davis is kind of doing his farewell tour. Well, will be his farewell tour, you know, in the Confederate States, and he's stopping and making all these speeches that are like, don't worry, this is fine. He's like that dog that is sitting at the coffee drinking the coffee.
Yeah.
This is fine. And Lee's kind of doing the same thing with this. And you read about that in various accounts, including Gordon's, where he's always like, Lee was there, always in charge, always trying to lead the men.
Yeah, no, he was. And he's still looking for food. So right around now, while they're on their march, he's going to find out again, another rumor that there are 80,000 rations now that are found in the town of Farmville, which is just 20 miles away. And recently, Mary, I found out Farmville was not just a video game. It's a real town. Okay. That's where Lee was going. Right.
Farmville. I remember Farmville.
Oh,
I never
yeah,
played.
of course.
I never
Farmville
played
back in the
Farmville,
day.
but I remember my friends playing Farmville.
But here's the thing about it though. This is food that was delivered from Danville. There were rumors of warm bread, ham, French onion soup of all things. That's
Oh
what they
my
were
God.
alleged
I would have
waiting.
taken off running. I would have been like, yes.
And this is supposed to be food that was supplied from Danville. Now it must have felt like a gift from God when they heard this news. It's ironic that who was born in Farmville, Virginia, of all people?
Oh. Was it
Joseph Johnston. The guy
That's
who they're
right.
going to meet, they're
Yeah.
going to go to his hometown to get food. They're going to probably knock on his parents' door, ding dong, and get some food, right?
And visit the DQ.
Now, I know what you're thinking, Mary. I know what you're thinking, okay? Is what's Grant doing at this time, okay? Now, his army is also on the move, and they are moving in an amazing 35 miles per day clip. That's how fast they're going.
Well, that's what getting fresh bread every day. I'm not saying they're getting it this time, but that's what they probably had enough rations to keep them going. I mean, if you have food, you can keep going. And these guys are probably like, we're at the end of this shitstorm. Let's get it done. And I mean, Grant knows how to inspire his men, right?
Well, he does, but he knows how to inspire his guys, but he knows Lee can too. He knows Lee is on this hellish march, but Grant is still afraid of what Lee's capable of. Grant quotes, he says, Lee is in a bad fix, but if I were in his place, I think I could get away with part of the army. I suppose Lee will. Now, we're going to talk about this here in a little while towards the end of this, but him splitting up his army was Grant and Lincoln's worst nightmare. And we'll talk about that specifically towards the very end.
Yeah.
But Grant is also reiterating to Sheridan and George Meade, okay, you mentioned him, that the plan now is not just to follow Lee. They got to get ahead of him and they got to cut him off.
Yep.
They got to stop him, right?
Exactly.
So on April 6th again, while the Rebs are heading to Farmville, okay, Grant is going to order Sheridan to move northwest and it's going to be setting up a move here that is going to put him ahead of Lee and set up that pincer motion, that movement against Lee's army. So Sheridan is going to be with the 6th Corps, okay? And they're going to move ahead while the Rebs are moving along a stream called Sailor's Creek, okay? At this moment, this part of Lee's army, which is basically Richard Yule and John B. Gordon, they're going to get cut off from the rest of Lee's army at this point, okay? And the rest of the army in Northern Virginia. And when they realize and they learn that the federal troops are right on them at this point, they're going to fall back to a position on the high grounds near a place called Hillsman's House.
Mhm. And this is going to be the Battle of Sailor's Creek. And it's actually going to be three different battles. And it's described as being a very bloody engagement, possibly one of the bloodier ones of the Civil War. And I mean, this is what happens when you're near the end of the war. You're going to fight hard, and it's going to be brutal. So the three different battles are the Battle of Lockett's Farm, which is General Humphreys versus Gordon. Um, and Gordon describes as being absolutely brutal. He said, a column struck my command while we were endeavoring to push the ponderous wagon trains through the bog, out of which the starved teams were unable to drag them. Many of these wagons, loaded with ammunition, mired so deep in the mud that they had to be abandoned. And this again gets back to the train that they're going over. So, they don't have food, but they had that ammo and they have to abandon it. And they're not taking that with them. And this is, again, it's kind of like the Fort Stedman thing. We didn't need to lose anymore. They're not losing men this time, but they're losing ammo. And then you had the Battle of Marshall's Crossroads, which is Crook and Merritt on the Union versus Richard Anderson. And you have the Battle of Hillsman House, which is Wright for the Union and Yule for the Confederate.
And just look at the overall numbers. The Confederates don't really have a chance here. Okay. Sheridan and Wright had 26,000 guys here.
Yep.
Okay. And the Rebs had about 18,000, give or take. And the Rebs knew they had to make a stand, right? Despite that hunger, despite that fatigue. The Sixth Corps under Horatio Wright is going to move in a position, just like you were saying, and they're going to move into battle lines. Okay. And this is going to focus on that Hillsman House area, but they're going to advance and attack up that slope towards that house. Now, the Rebs are also going to be hit by Custer's cavalry, who's going to notice two huge gaps on that rebel line. Now, the Union is going to hit them with vicious artillery barrage as well. One rebel soldier said, I had seldom seen fire more accurate and not one that has been more deadly. So they're getting hit with all three aspects here,
Yep.
right? The Rebs are going to begin to falter. And like I said, they don't have much of a chance here anyway. And Sheridan sees them begin to fail a little bit and yells to his men, go through them, they're demoralized as hell. That's what he says, right? Picture's high-pitched voice, he's 3 feet tall, but that's
Go
what he yells,
through
okay?
it.
Okay. But the Rebs actually were not demoralized, okay? And when the Feds hit that rebel line on that hillside, it resulted in some of the most vicious hand-to-hand combat. You're talking to guys fighting with fists. They were scratching with fingernails. They were biting at ears and throats. I don't know if Mike Tyson was involved, but that's
Oh,
probably that type of thing he would have
God.
done. I mean, they're literally. There's a one story of a Union soldier who got bayoneted through the stomach so hard it pinned him to the ground. And before he died, he was able to shoot the guy who stabbed him. There was stories of
Oh.
friendly fire where it was so much smoke and fog that guys are taking their bayonets and taking their muskets and cracking skulls of their own soldiers because they didn't know who the hell it was. That's how bad this was, right? The Feds kept coming, and the numbers, like most of these battles, do eventually tell the story, and the Confederates do get overwhelmed with this, right? Now,
Yep.
while this is all going on, Lee is going to be on a ridge riding on his horse, and he's going to be astonished at what he sees. Okay.
Yep.
He's going to turn to General William Mahone. We talked about him many times, and he's going to say, my God, has the army been dissolved? And Mahone's going to turn to him and say, no, General, here are troops ready to do their duty, his guys, and ready to fight. You know what Lee does? Lee is going to be cool and calm, okay?
Yep.
But allegedly, at this point, he loses his shit. He's friggin' had it. He's done, okay? I mean, he's going to grab the battle flag and he's going to rally his guys. Now, this flag has caused the deaths of 5 guys at this point being shot down. So Lee doing this must have really scared the hell out of his guys. Mahone is going to sit there with his jaw dropped, okay, in
Yeah.
stunned silence as Lee is going to ride by him to wave in his flag. Now, at one point, I don't know, this sounds like Douglas Southall Freeman crap, but I guess at one point, the wind blows and catches the flag and wraps the flag around Lee like he's a superhero, and everybody gets all teary. And then someone yells, who's the man who won't follow Uncle Robert? And they'll go, yeah. And they all start going together towards the slaughter, all these Mahone's guys, right? So who knows? But
Yeah.
that's the story. Now,
Gordon writes about that. He said General Lee was riding everywhere and watching everything, encouraging his brave men by his calm and cheerful bearing. And he also mentions he was often exposed to great danger from shells and bullets.
Oh, there's no doubt he was at the front. There's no question. But at the end of the day, the Rebs are going to get their asses handed to them at Sailor's Creek, right?
Big time. And a lot of them captured too, including Yule. Yule's probably the most known Confederate that is going to get captured at this battle. And I have a funny quote here from Gordon. He said, "Rushing through the broad gap between Ewell and myself, the heavy Federal force soon surrounded the command of that brave old one-legged hero and forced him to surrender." I just
Well,
think, one-legged
Richard Yule.
hero. I can't get that out of my mind now.
Oh God, one-legged hero. I know who one-armed hero is. but
One-armed.
one-legged
Ooh.
hero. God, anyway. Okay.
No,
But
no,
this
Yule.
is
Ew.
but Richard Yule, this is the guy who lost a leg at Groveton.
Yep.
He helped fill that void lost by Stonewall Jackson when he got killed at Chancellorsville.
Yep.
And he's going to be captured along with a lot of guys, and also Joseph Kershaw gets captured here. Now, it's interesting is when Yule's captured, he's surrendered. Okay, he reportedly he drops his knees and starts crying, and he says,
Sounds like Yule.
Our cause is lost." And then he says to somebody else, "Lee needs to surrender before more lives are lost." Okay. But for Yule, he'll be shipping up to Boston, where he'll spend the next 4 months of his life as a prisoner of Fort Warren in Boston Harbor. That's where he's going to go, right up the street here. That's where he's
Nice.
going to go. And this Sailor's Creek disaster will be known in the Confederacy later as Black Thursday.
Yeah.
That's what it's going to be called, right? So again, to what you said at the very beginning of this, you don't have a lot of guys anyway. And now you just lost 8,000 more.
Yeah.
And you lost a couple of big generals too, as well.
Yeah, you lose like Ewell, Kershaw, the son of General Lee, Custis Lee is captured here too. You have Seth B. Barton, Sims, Meriwether Lewis Clark. I just wrote that down because it was a cool name. And Montgomery D. Corse, among a few others that were captured as well. Like this is like Sailor's Creek is probably the worst battle for the Confederates in the Appomattox campaign. And it is just, it's absolutely horrific fighting. But what it does for the Union is it makes Sheridan see something, to the point where he writes a letter to Grant, telegram, and Lincoln gets word of what Sheridan has said. And the one thing that Sheridan said, that he said, "If the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender."
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Sheridan says to Grant.
And Lincoln, of course, famously responds,
"Yep, let the thing be pressed."
Let the thing be pressed, right? So that's one of those famous things. This comes out of Sailor's Creek. Now, the next day is April 7th, okay? And Lee is going to keep moving, and he's going to make it to Farmville, in what's left of his army, where those rations actually are there, okay? And they're going to be starting to be passed out to his guys, to his gleeful and thankful men. Now, Farmville is just north of the Appomattox River, okay? And Lee felt where he was that he could breathe and he could catch his breath a little bit from Grant's guys, because the river was swollen, and he had thought that all the bridges that crossed it were burned by the Confederates. They thought they could just chill. They had some time to relax, okay? Now, while Lee's sitting at this headquarters there, he's going to meet with Secretary of War John Breckinridge. He's going to show up from Richmond. He's going to ride by. He's on his way to Danville chasing Deborah Davis and his little thing, right? And after the meeting, Breckinridge is going to wire Davis, who was, like I said, he's on his own little retreat, and he's going to say to Davis, "The situation is not favorable." So he's like, these guys are friggin' screwed, right? But all of a sudden, news comes to Lee that is a complete disaster. And he has that complete old man pucker effect situation, okay? Despite what he thought, okay, not all the bridges over the river were destroyed, and he was vulnerable. He didn't realize it. There was a bridge called the High Bridge, which is still passable when they realized, and when they realized that the feds were already basically there. You know why it was called the High Bridge, Mary?
Why was it called the High Bridge, Darren?
Because it was high. It's 125 feet high.
Wow, that's taller than me.
Sometimes the easiest answer is the answer, okay? But the Appomattox River no longer separated Lee from Grant, because Lee thought he had some time. Now he realizes he doesn't. So you know what he does? He loses his mind. Now Lee's that's it. I'm pissed, right?
Yep.
So he's pissed. He's how the F do we lose to Buffalo mad? That's how angry he is, okay? And he's going to order his men out of Farmville ASAFP, to get across the Potomac south as fast as they can. Now,
Yeah.
it's sad because not all the men had got their rations yet.
No,
They were in line for food, and they had to watch in misery as the wagons started to roll away and they didn't get any food and they were starving.
that would suck if you were waiting for your blizzard at the DQ
Well,
and it was just like, they're like, no, we can't do it. Sorry.
and you do that to people with a gleam in your eye. But Grant, just a couple hours later, Grant's going to find himself in Farmville in the early afternoon, and he knew Lee was in a tough spot at this point. He does, and he decides maybe it's time to reach out to this rebel commander and see if he wants to call it quits. Okay.
Yep.
And this is when this is going to begin these letters back and forth. Now, we could read the letters, okay, and they're great letters. But what we decided to do is write them as if they were in today's time and they were text messages. So what we're going to do is put this in modern times, okay? So anyway, here's how I'm going to be Grant. Here's how Grant's first letter to Lee would have probably sounded, okay? You ready?
Yep.
Hey, by now you realize the jig is up and you are screwed. I know where you are, so don't make me come down there and mess you up. How about you give it the old quit and we call it a day before more people get hurt? Okay, that's what he's going to say. Now, many of the Confederates, okay, at this point, are going to share Grant's thoughts, okay, including a guy named General Henry Wise, the former governor of Virginia, who's going to write Lee to his face. And this is a real letter. This is a real one, okay? He's going to say this to Lee's face, okay, and someone's going to write it down. This army is hopelessly whipped and is fast becoming demoralized. These men have already endured more than I believe flesh and blood can stand, and I say to you, sir, emphatically, that to prolong the struggle is murder, and that blood of every man who is killed from this point on is on your head, General Lee. So he says to him, he says to Lee, okay?
Wow.
And so I don't know if he said, it's all my fault. I beg of you, pray to me now. It's all my fault.
My fault.
But clearly, Lee did not get a harum from that guy, whatever that was, okay? But anyways, Lee is going to get a letter. Is going to get that letter from Grant, the one that is paraphrased, okay? And he's going to show it to James Longstreet for his thoughts. Now, Longstreet is going to hem and haw.
As Longstreet does.
It does. But he felt the time wasn't right to surrender. He famously says, not yet, right? And Lee responded back, but the letter must be returned, sir. So he is going to sit and craft another interesting response, which Mary is going to read right now.
He does. Received your text. Seriously? You think the Army of Northern Virginia is done? Nope. Don't share that sentiment. However, I 100% agree that there needs to be no ass kickings. But before considering anything, just out of idle curiosity, because apparently I have nothing better to do, I'd like to know what terms you offer on condition of surrender. Again, this is not a binding agreement, Sam. I am not surrendering my damn army. Sincerely, Bob.
Wow. Now, that letter, okay, if you could read through all that, was obviously probing for terms, right? Now, remember, U.S. Grant, remember what his nickname was?
Unconditional surrender.
It was Sam. Yeah, it was unconditional surrender.
Yeah, and
right?
Sam. And Sam.
It's Sam. Okay. So Grant so he knew his personal stakes, Leah's, in his personal future depended on what Grant's whims were, right? Now, we didn't talk a lot about the River Queen, okay? But going back to that real quick, okay? An extra special turn back time situation.
If I could turn back time.
Okay. 2.0, okay? They talked about the terms, and the terms were basically let these guys turn in their guns, let them go home.
Yeah, that's what Lincoln wanted. And the River Queen was this meeting that was Lincoln, Grant, Sherman, and Admiral Porter. There's a famous painting of it. You can tell that Sherman is completely dominating the conversation, which is typical Sherman. There's a rainbow in the background out of the window of the boat, which it's like, well, that's random. But apparently Porter is the only one to record what happened in the conversation. But this is the conversation with which Grant took away what he knew to be the terms and also what Sherman knew to be the terms. Now, we did an episode last year about Bentonville and the surrender there, and we all know what happened with Sherman there. But, the one thing Lincoln didn't want was the generals to get in kind of political shit. That was the one thing that he said. He's like, don't do political shit.
Well, he's not sure what's going on, but at that point, Lee is still feisty, and he's going to tell Longstreet, I will strike that man a blow in the morning. And when another officer came up to Lee and asked if they were are we thinking of surrendering? He says, surrender? I trust it has not come to that, right? So April 8th, Grant's men, okay, they're marching along and passing the bodies of dead Rebs, okay, on the side of
Yep.
the road, as well as these sullen deserters who have just about given up. They just about had it, okay? And Grant, upon receiving Lee's response, is going to craft a second letter, or a second text in this case, okay? And by all accounts, he agonized over it. Some say it took Grant 6 hours to write this letter. 6
Wow.
hours, okay? So in today's lingo, he's going to respond back. Look, Robert, I just want this shit to end, okay? And all I want is for you guys to quit and not fight us again. I'll tell you what, if you don't want to be embarrassed, just send someone to surrender in your place. I don't give an F. Send Longstreet. I know you already hate him, LOL. So that's what he's going to send back to Grant, okay? And so Grant's real fear, okay, now again, we talked about this before. Grant's real fear, and we're going to talk about this more next time, is Lee splitting up the army and fighting that guerrilla war that will go on forever, right? Now, this is the tactic used in the American Revolution, what we saw in the Civil War with guys like John Mosby, Bloody Bill Anderson, John Hunt Morgan. So it was not unusual to do this, right? Lee's going to receive Grant's second message, okay, the one that I just read, and he wasn't having it, okay, and he wants to have a face-to-face meeting with him, with that Union commander, to learn more of what his intentions were. So he's going to write one more letter to Grant to talk about those intentions.
Yep. Okay, Sam. I know we are on two different sides here, somewhat two different countries, or at least that's what I'm trying for. But I'm pretty sure I sent that last text to you in English, which we both speak, and nowhere did I say I would like to surrender my army. I'm not on Facebook, but I don't, as the kids say, do vague booking, though I hear Longstreet does, and Jackson was bad for it, especially over the whole Garnett fiasco. I swear I have an army of drama queens. Let me say it again. I was just curious as to what your terms would be. In all honesty, I think things are cool with my army right now, and I really don't think we need to surrender. But you mentioned peace. I just wanted to know if your proposals would lead to that. Just saying. This is an all around about way of saying I ain't surrendering to you, but I would be willing to meet to discuss the possibility of peace. There is a difference. So 10 a.m. tomorrow on the Old Stage Road to Richmond between the two armies? What do you think? LMK, that means let me know, Sam. Sincerely, Bob.
So you can see how that was. Now, Grant he's gonna get these letters, and he's
like, what the fuck?
Well, the thing about Grant, okay, is Lee sends that letter back to Grant, okay, and Grant, by all reports, is suffering from a intense migraine. Or maybe it was a hangover. We don't know. We have to ask Charles Dana. But I guess by all accounts,
I was wondering too if it was because when it severe, I was questioning that when I read that in the research. I'm like, and I've always wondered that about migraine or hangover, but I will go with migraine here because
this one was a migraine. This was a migraine.
It was a migraine. Trust me, you can get migraines from stress. I get them. But
he had stress. His anxiety level was through the damn roof.
Yeah.
Reportedly, he was taking mustard plasters on his wrists.
Yep.
And he took several hot foot baths. Okay.
It was a treatment for migraines back then.
Yeah. But nothing eased this migraine. Now, he's going to get Lee's letter. He's going to read Lee's response, which he thought was brash, admittedly. And he's going to read it aloud to his staff. And he's going to say, well, it looks as if General Lee still means to fight. Okay. And he knew, okay, as to that rebel commander, that he still had one more card to play. Lee did. Okay. And before Lee's going to surrender that army. And I wonder what that card could be, Mary. And I tell you what, for the rest of the story, we'll pick it up next time. But we'll leave it there about how this is going to end, okay? But how it's going to end will be a fun story to talk about. So that's how we're going to drop it off, I think, right at that point. We're going to leave with a little cliffhanger, Mary, about how it's going to go. So we're going to leave the boys down there in Appomattox about how they're going to do. Lee is trying to formulate his game plan for the next morning of April 9th. Picture Grant sitting there with his feet in the hot bath
with
this
mustard plasters on his
there
wrists, and agonizing over what the fuck is going to happen next.
with the hangovers. It's probably a migraine, realistically. We
Migraine
tease
hangover.
Grant. We know it's a migraine. Anyway, so we're gonna take a break. We're gonna stop it at that point. We're gonna leave it at there. So I think to summarize this point is a lot of people talk about Appomattox. You talk about the courthouse. You talk about his
Yep.
surrender. You talk about all this stuff. But I think a lot of people don't really appreciate the pure misery of this march from Petersburg that's going to culminate
No.
in this. I can only imagine your beaten army. You just saw your capital fall. Your president's running around trying to take off and hide. Okay, you've got Sarah Slater with the Confederate gold doing who the hell knows
Yeah,
what with this.
she's
right?
going up to Canada with it to
Okay.
gamble at our casinos, probably.
Right. Probably at that place in Ontario there, whatever it's called.
Yeah, the town I work in, Clinton. She's
Yeah.
probably at the casino. Yeah.
But you're running away. You just want to get the hell away for one last chance. You get to Amelia Courthouse and the food is gone.
Yeah.
And now everywhere you go is blocked. You think you finally get a chance to eat because someone doesn't get a ford for the bridge, because someone doesn't burn the high bridge. Now you're consistently on the run. And unlike previous Union commanders, you're not just McClellan or Burnside. Every time Meade hits him, he keeps coming. So Lee has to deal with that factor where he's used to being hit and then falling back, and then they all cool off and they get hit again. He's coming and coming and coming. Just that overland campaign, that hammer and the nail keeps swinging. And Lee is going to get to a point where he's going to have a real decision he has to make on the early morning of April 9th. And he's going to give it one more shot. And we're going to talk about that next time.
Yeah, we are. And I mean, if anybody, the one of the sources I used for this was Gordon's memoirs. And I know Gordon has been accused of embellishing and whatever, but it's still, it's a source for the retreat from Petersburg. And I mean, I think he's laying it out how it was. It was a shitty situation. I mean, he's leaving Petersburg and he's leaving his wife behind. And he's talking about how he and Lee and the other generals are like, they're going on like little to no sleep for this, a lot of the campaign. The men still have fight in them, but they're not getting the food that they need. And he talks about just, men dropping off out of starvation, out of exhaustion, because they don't have the rations they need. I think he tells the retreat a lot like it was horrible. And he does say before the Battle of Sailor's Creek, going into that, the Army of Northern Virginia was a skeleton of what it had been.
Yeah.
And that just like Sailor's Creek really hit them hard. But then you go back to something like Stedman, where they lose those 4,000 guys, that you can't keep losing those men. And just like you can't keep losing them along the way. But I mean, his memoirs, that last part of his memoirs for this, like just the retreat, talk about how brutal it was. And this is a guy who was on, he was on the Gettysburg Retreat.
Yeah, no, he was.
Saw it.
Mm-hmm. So again, this is out of all the retreats you talk about, this one's probably the worst of them all.
I think so.
And also there was points where it snowed on this. They had to walk through snow across Virginia.
Yeah, the muddy and all that. But then, you have the Union Army that is in constant pursuit of them. And you have to remember the big factor here is the food. The men are able to get the nourishment. Now, granted, they're not going to be getting it as they're going, but they're able to take more rations with them because they have that supply, right? So they're able to feed their horses. They're able to feed their men. And these men are also going on like, we're almost at the end. And they're being led like by men, Grant, Meade. And I hate the guy, but I'm sorry. Sheridan probably inspired a lot of morale in his men too.
Well, they did. I mean, he's in charge of that army, the Shenandoah. And although he's under Grant, he's still independent and he's still doing his thing. But I think, this will be a good thing to talk about next time. And for our little conversation, the Civil War, for the most part of the Army of Northern Virginia, is going to end, and then it's going to pick up right at Sumter right afterwards again. That's how the timing goes.
Yep.
But I think it's a good thing to talk about. So I know what's coming up next, but I'm going to ask you again, Fincheroo, what's next for us?
So next we are talking Appomattox Part 2. And then afterwards we have to sit down and talk about what our episodes are. We will be having our roundtable in April. not doing a Facebook Live. If y'all are listening to this, we're not doing a Facebook Live on the weekend, but we will be doing one sometime again soon, which we will post about that. And yeah, we will be hanging with y'all again soon.
All right. So off we go. Some fun stuff coming down the pike for us. So we will look forward to the beginning of baseball season, Mary, which is pretty good. Some of us have a team that actually has a shot. Others, well, not so much, but it's okay. That's all part of the fun. That's part of being a fan, right?
The Great Halt is apparently part of the history of my team now from 2016 World Series.
It's too funny. All right. So off we go. So Mary, again, the pleasure. We say this many, many times, of course, is always all yours. And we will look forward to some fun stuff coming for us down the pike when we do our next live, whenever that happens to be, whenever we figure this thing out. So off we go. Thanks, everybody, listening. We appreciate it. Everyone have a great weekend. Everybody have a safe weekend. Hopefully the weather is warming up where you are. Hopefully your team loses, unless you are a fan of the Red Sox. And we will have some fun with everything else down the road. So good night, everybody. Have a great day.
See you guys later.
Peace out. Go Sox.
Go Tribe.
Go Tribe. Doesn't sound